Okay, this should be the last one. The last section. I think it's part 5 in the videos. Section 4 in the notes called Americans on the Home Front. I put this one at the end because I thought it was really kind of one of the most important sections of the whole thing. And this is really showing like how America can pull together when we need to, because this part is basically about like what are Americans doing at home while the soldiers are fighting overseas? What are we doing to support them? Okay, and a lot of this is really important to the fact that we're successful. Now, a lot of things change when the war breaks out and when the Americans join the war. So some ideas were, first of all, businesses start to change the way they do things. In 1915, 2 years prior to war, Henry Ford said he would rather burn down his factories than make anything for the war. He was just going to keep making cars, and he didn't care about the war because he didn't support the war. 2 years later, he was asked to make 16,000 tanks, and he made even more than that. He made planes, he made guns, he did everything he needed to do to bring all the Americans home, and other factories did the same. If you wanted to buy a washing machine during the war, you couldn't because they were using the steel to make other things. Dress factories were making uniforms for the soldiers. Other types of factories were converted over to make these goods. One of the really big things about war is it's extremely expensive, and the government needed to raise money to pay for the war, and so they started selling bonds. Now, the idea of a bond is just like a U.S. savings bond. Someone goes in and pays $50 for it, but if you cash it in right away, you might only get 25. You had to hold on to it for a number of years for it to get up to its regular cost. So, people invested in bonds and basically lent their money to the country. This allowed the U.S. to raise about $20 billion for the war, about a quarter of the cost. You could even buy bonds at school. Kids could bring in, I think it was 25 cents a week, and once you brought in $5, you got yourself a $5 bond. A lot of people thought that buying bonds was a show of patriotism. I've actually read about some situations where kids didn't bring in their quarters on Friday and would get beat up at recess for not supporting the war effort. Some other things that happened where the economy was managed differently. Things became a little bit more scarce if they were needed for the war. And so the government took the responsibility of telling businesses what to produce and how much, but also like what prices they could charge. A man named Bernard Baruch was put in front of the War Industries Board, where they rationed out raw materials to the people that needed them, like iron and steel, oil. And he also told those businesses what they could do and even did some price fixing, what they could charge. The National War Labor Board was set up to monitor labor disputes between labor and their owners because they didn't want strikes to happen because the things were so highly needed. In 1917, Congress also passed the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act, which allowed them to control the distribution of food, the production of food, and fuel as well. They started to put limits on how much certain people could buy and how much families could have. Now, Herbert Hoover played a really important part in this role. So later, after the war, go on to become an American president. Not a very good one, unfortunately. But he was named the head of the Food Administration. And what he did was he put price controls on how much food could cost in stores. Since there was less available for American citizens because of the amount being sent over, it would have been easy for stores to raise the prices on things, and he didn't want that to get out of control. But they also rationed certain things. You were sent a little booklet with stamps, and those stamps could be used to buy certain kinds of food. Like, for instance, families only got so much butter, sugar, and meat per week. And if you used up your stamps for those things, you couldn't purchase more until you got more stamps. There were voluntary meatless Tuesdays, and so they basically asked everyone to go vegetarian on Tuesdays. And that was one way you could be a good American. And they had wheatless Wednesdays. They offered a tax break if you grew your own garden, because that way you weren't buying things from the government. And they actually paid people to raise their own pigs and farm animals that they could use for meat for themselves. The Fuel Administration also started. They had days where you weren't allowed to buy gas for your cars. Imagine that one in the world that we live in today. There not being like gas available on Sundays and Wednesdays to save fuel for the war effort. They also started daylight savings time. The thought was they were going to save coal and other fuels by adjusting the work schedule to the light schedule so you wouldn't have to use as much light to light the factories. So when you spring ahead and fall back, you can blame World War I. It started in 1917. Now, some things about loyalty. A lot of things in wartime change. And the First Amendment becomes a little less important, that protects your freedom of speech. And that's monitored a little bit more closely. Anything that could get soldiers potentially in danger was monitored a little more than before. George Creel was put in charge of the Committee for Public Information, which was designed to rally support. These guys are the ones that developed their propaganda within our country. People started to fear things that were foreign. They thought they might be spies. And so all of a sudden, you had to pass a literacy test to immigrate into the country. And people became really anti-German and feared anything that was German in name or nature. Wisconsin had a record number of legal name changes because people started changing their names from German-sounding things to American-sounding things. You couldn't get the German measles; you got the Liberty measles. German chocolate cake was freedom cake. The Frankfurter, even more popularly, starts becoming known as the hot dog during World War I. Some other changes. Wilson warned people that if they were disloyal toward the United States, they could be dealt with charges of treason. And so in 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act, which made it illegal for anybody to interfere with a draft. If someone was drafted, they had to report. If anyone did anything to stop them from reporting, they could be jailed. They also passed the Sedition Act, which was monitored disloyal speech and behavior. Anything that was spying, anything that could cause problems was covered in this, and obviously you could be charged with treason and killed. Women and minorities played a huge role in the war effort. Women started to assume some of the roles that men had during the war. Now, maybe not the same pay, but they started to do jobs that women didn't usually do, and minorities also saw the benefits, and their wages increased. Some people say this is why women were given the right to vote after World War I, and minorities generally saw a job wage increase after the war as well. They also obviously gained new job skills, which were put into use after the war. Now, all of this pulled together, the Americans become this machine. We actually called ourselves the Arsenal for Democracy. But probably the biggest flaw of what happened in World War I was the peace treaty that ended it. Woodrow Wilson had his own plan called the 14 Points. The 14 Points were 14 separate ideas, how to sign this treaty and make sure that there wouldn't be any further problems. And Woodrow Wilson pushed this idea of what he called peace without victory, an end to the war without anyone getting blamed, without anybody being punished. He felt that this was probably the best way to make sure that there wouldn't be any further problems. Because if someone got blamed, there'd be a desire for revenge. Unfortunately, that's not really what happened. The other people involved in the Big Four, the four leaders who decided how things went, Woodrow Wilson from the United States, Georges Clemenceau from France, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, and David Lloyd George from England, three of them decided they wanted to gain something from this. Eventually, Wilson brings back a treaty to the United States that has parts of the 14 Points, including the League of Nations, a group of countries that would get together to make sure that peace was kept around the world, kind of like the United Nations does today. However, the United States Senate was very upset with the treaty because they didn't want to get involved in any more European problems, so they refused to sign the treaty, which left us out of the League of Nations. The fact that we weren't in the League of Nations cut down on some of its power. It made it seem like less of a real group. People didn't think without our military and the fact that we were so strong, the League of Nations had any real power. But one of the positives that came out of this was several new nations were created, like Poland, the separate countries of Austria and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, different places that kind of went along with that idea of nationalism. The difficult part about the treaty, though, was it basically did blame Germany completely for the war, even though they didn't start it. And that treaty itself becomes the largest cause of World War II. And a soldier comes home named Adolf Hitler, who will later go on to cause some problems. That's it for World War I. Again, now get yourself to work on the other things that you need to get this done.